It's 10 years since the Henry Tax Review was handed down, but a decade later, virtually none of its recommendations have seen the light of day. Now, the review's architect, former Treasury Secretary Ken Henry, says the need for genuine tax reform is more pressing than ever. And on climate change, he says Australia desperately needs a carbon price, but it will probably be far away. Ken Henry spoke exclusively with the ABC's senior digital business reporter, Mark Yanda.
Ken Henry, in your tax review's final report, you said that the significant reforms required would take some time to implement. Did you expect that 10 years on, virtually none of them would be in place?
Oh, no, I didn't. I did expect that it would take some decades. I probably should explain that when we were commissioned to write the review, that was in the 2008 budget. And if you cast your mind back to 2008, long time, but it's pre-GFC. And in those days, the Commonwealth budget was in very, very, very good shape. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say that the Commonwealth government was finding it difficult to figure out what to do with all the money. And so we thought we had an historic opportunity to develop a particular tax reform package that we'd be able to implement with overcompensation. And this is always, you know, for a tax reformer, that's the great thing to have, the great weapon to have is the ability to provide overcompensation.
That's the sell.
That's the sell. And when Lehman Brothers collapsed a few months later, September 2008, the budget, and then given the fiscal response to rescue Australia from an impending recession, the budget, of course, wasn't in that sort of shape. And so we changed our stature, our state. And we decided that instead of developing a single tax reform package for implementation, we'd be even more ambitious and identify pathways for reform over several decades. So we did anticipate, as we were developing the tax review, that it would take some decades possibly for all of the measures to be implemented. Having said that, I am today absolutely stunned that so little has actually been implemented.
And how much is that costing Australia, that lack of tax reform?
Well, it's costing Australia quite a lot. All Australians would be aware of Australia's particularly poor productivity performance in recent years, confirmed as recently as yesterday's September quarter national accounts figures. This is not a mere cyclical phenomenon. It looks like there's a secular productivity slump. We need to find some way out of this productivity slump. Australians would also be aware that despite very good labour force participation performance in recent years, if you look at average hours worked, the decline in average hours of work, increased part-time and underemployment, that fully offsets the increase in workforce participation. In fact, it's stark that if you look at, if you calculate how many hours are worked in a week by the average person of working age across males and females, it's no different today than it was 40 years ago, despite the fact that female workforce participation has increased by 45%. So that massive increase in female workforce participation, but despite that, male workforce participation has declined by about 10% over that period, and average hours of work have declined and continue to decline. We have a real workforce participation problem in Australia. And when we were constructing the framework to guide the development of these pathways in the tax review, we were focused very much on what we could do to sustainably lift productivity growth and also sustainably lift workforce participation.
Two of the big tax reforms that did take place during your time as Treasury Secretary, the carbon tax and the mining tax, were quickly unwound. Looking back, what do you think of those decisions to unwind those taxes?
Both have cost Australia enormously. If you look at the emissions trading scheme, and remember that in 2007, going into the November 2007 election, Australia had the Commonwealth government, which was led by John Howard at the time, the Commonwealth government, every state government, every territory government, bipartisan support, in fact tripartisan support, because the Greens are also supportive of a broad-based emissions trading scheme. That's the state of the Australian political system going into the election in November 2007. Of course, when Kevin Rudd was elected, he sought to legislate the emissions trading scheme under the acronym CPRS, Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme, and for political reasons. It was blocked. Well, first the Greens blocked it because they considered that it wasn't sufficiently ambitious. And then, of course, for different political reasons, the opposition blocked the implementation of the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. Since then, we have not had a coherent climate change policy in Australia. And as a consequence, we've not had coherent energy policy in Australia.
Do you think we ever will have a coherent climate change policy in Australia? Will we ever have a carbon price?
I'm not sure that we will. I'm not sure that we will. I certainly hope that we will. We desperately need it. And for that, you only have to look at the position that Australia's energy companies are in with respect to investment decision making. Hasn't exactly been a drought on investment decision making in Australia in the energy sector, but certainly the risk premium on investment projects in the energy sector in Australia is extraordinarily high, except with respect to certain solar projects, of course, because in any state of the world, it's pretty clear that solar is going to be a winner. But there is considerable policy uncertainty. We don't really have a rational energy policy in Australia at the moment, and that's extraordinary.
And can Australia have any hope of meeting its carbon emissions reductions targets without a carbon price?
Oh, well, it could be done, but it would be much more economically damaging than with a carbon price, and of course that's the point. And that's when Prime Minister Howard established the task group on emissions trading late in 2006. And then endorsed the recommendations. That's what the task group on emissions trading said to Prime Minister Howard is, if you're going to have a cap on emissions, then you need to ask yourself the question, what is the least economically damaging way of achieving that capped amount of emissions? Answer, emissions trading scheme. Now, if you're going to achieve a cap on emissions through some other means, it must be more economically damaging. That's the choice.
Your report did argue that taxes and tax changes need to be done with consideration to the least harm to economic efficiency, promoting equity, and minimising the complexity of the system. How does Australia's tax system rate at the moment on those measures, and has it gotten better or worse since you did your tax review?
I'd say that overall it's gotten worse. We added two other principles. We added policy consistency and sustainability. And on those two principles, it's unambiguously worse. For instance, consider that in 2007-8, personal income taxes made up 44.5% of the Commonwealth's total tax collections. 44.5%. In the most recent budget for 2019-2020, the government is estimating that despite all of the personal income tax cuts that have been implemented since 2007-8 and the ones being implemented now, personal income tax collections will be 49% of total tax revenue collections by the Commonwealth. For the next year, they are projecting more than 50%. And right through the forward estimates period, personal income tax revenue is an increasing share of tax revenue collections. Does anybody seriously consider that that is sustainable, that the tax policy that we have in Australia is simply one of fiscal drag? Does anybody seriously consider that sustainable? It cannot be sustainable. And I can't imagine the electorate putting up with it. On the other side, if you look at the goods and services tax, now of course all the revenue from the goods and services tax goes to the states and territories, but it's legislated by the Commonwealth and it's collected by the Commonwealth. And much earlier in my career I led Prime Minister Howard's task force that designed the goods and services tax package. And when we were designing it, we wanted it to have as broad a base as possible on household consumption. But by the time it had got through the Australian Parliament, largely courtesy of negotiations with the Australian Democrats at the time, the tax, although we described it as a broad-based goods and services tax, only applied to about 2/3 of household consumption expenditure.
And that's shrinking now.
Today, it's just over 50%. So from 2/3 to a half in the time that the goods and services tax has been there, no wonder the states and territories are in quite a difficult position with respect to revenue sustainability, and it really is a sustainability issue for them. And what else do they have? If you consider the other tax bases that are available to the states and territories, things like stamp duties on property transfers, good heavens, that's a diabolical tax, and everybody knows it's a diabolical tax. It's, for one thing, it's hugely volatile. You would not want to design a household budget on the basis of that sort of revenue stream. Another big source of revenue for the states, although not all the states, is of course mining royalties. And look at what that's done to the West Australian budget. You know, catastrophic impact on the West Australian budget. And of course we had a proposal to deal with that as well, which is the mining tax that you referred to earlier, which was a national resource rent tax, replacing all of the mining royalties of all of the states with a revenue sharing agreement with each of the states according to where the revenue was coming from. That would have fixed that volatile impact on the West Australian budget.
So you clearly think the GST is broadening the base of the GST is one of the solutions to assist Australia's tax system?
It will have to happen. We cannot continue to put increasing reliance on the personal income tax system. We cannot. Not if we want to pursue a productivity enhancing agenda and also an agenda which enhances workforce participation. Putting increasing reliance on the personal income tax system is not going to cut it.
Now we have had, as you mentioned, tax cuts, personal income tax cuts. On your measures of fairness, simplicity and efficiency, how do the government's tax cuts stack up?
Yeah, okay, so there's an important issue here which that question opens up, which is the question of how you should measure fairness in particular. Almost any policy change to almost anything can be described as being unfair to somebody. Somebody's going to lose. And if that person is in already disadvantaged circumstances, then obviously the public's going to feel sorry for that person and they're not going to support the tax change. But what about all the other elements of government policy that are available to assist that person in disadvantaged circumstances that have nothing to do with the personal income tax system? It might be the family payment system. For example, it might be childcare, it might be something in the health system, you know. There's a whole range of policy instruments that are available to government to assist that person who would be seen to be not as well advantaged by a personal income tax cut. I mean, obviously nobody's absolutely disadvantaged, it's just that some don't get as much as others. And obviously it's very difficult to provide a personal income tax cut to somebody who doesn't pay tax. So what I would caution is that when you're making an assessment of the fairness of a particular proposal, put it in the broader framework and give consideration to all of the other instruments that are available to government to adjust, to compensate for any perceived deficiencies in terms of fairness. And there's another implication of that, and it's this, that in constructing a tax reform package, make it a package. Don't have it just on one change, one proposal. Construct it as a package involving compensating mechanisms and so on. Do the whole thing. Ensure that at the same time that you're dealing with fairness, you're not compromising efficiency. Ensure that at the same time as you're dealing with fairness and not compromising efficiency, you're not making the thing incredibly complex.
That is one of the risks around using some of those other payments and...
Absolutely it is, and we have seen that. And that's why in the tax review, we laid down principles to guide the future development of both taxes and transfer payments in a harmonious way.
Now, on the income tax cuts, one of the stated aims of those was to help boost consumer spending and kickstart what is a stalling economy at the moment. They don't seem to have accomplished that, at least so far. No. What would be a better solution to try and kickstart the economy?
I think it's time. We're not in the situation that we were in the global financial crisis when there was a big negative shock hitting the Australian economy. I think it's time to start asking ourselves a question of whether this is a mere cyclical slowdown or whether there's not a secular problem. Whether what we're seeing in terms of workforce productivity and workforce participation, particularly if you look at hours of work, whether this isn't pointing to some structural deficiencies in the Australian economy and something that cannot be overcome or addressed by either monetary policy or fiscal policy. It's time to start asking that question. Now, mind you, There are certainly productivity enhancing initiatives that the government could undertake that would be in the nature of a fiscal stimulus. And a lot of people have spoken about infrastructure, for example. And I too would recommend a consideration of infrastructure spending. I know that there are increased infrastructure spending. I mean, look, I know that infrastructure spending, public infrastructure spending is already high. But actually, if you look at public construction activity in Australia today, publicly funded construction activity in Australia today, as a proportion of GDP, it's not above historical averages. It's not.
So we've increased spending just to get back to where we should have been all along.
Sure, I would say that. Yes, I would say that. Secondly, it is said by some opponents of increased infrastructure spending that there are bottlenecks and problems in getting the right workforce. And that may be true in capital cities. Certainly there's a lot of construction activity going on in both Sydney and Melbourne. It's evident, and it may be difficult, but there's a lot of Australia outside of Sydney and Melbourne, and it's about time we paid attention to those parts of Australia as well and had regard to their infrastructure needs and also to the working opportunities of people living in those parts of Australia.
What role would tax reform play in boosting productivity?
Okay, so there's several things that tax reform can do to boost productivity. Firstly, as I indicated earlier, an emissions trading scheme, which I would see as part of a tax policy reform, would provide much enhanced certainty for investment decision making in the energy sector. Company tax rate cut. That was also part of our reform proposals. We proposed that the company tax rate be cut from 30% to 25% for all companies. We also proposed that there be symmetrical tax treatment of interest and rent and capital gains to deal with, in part, what we've seen, money going into negatively geared rental property rather than going into finance productive business investment. And we had recommendations in the report with respect to road user charging, replacing the excise system and motor vehicle registration fees and so on with a comprehensive national road user charging regime that would provide better signals to people on where providers of infrastructure, where roads should be built and so on, and would also guide people's decisions on which routes to take, when to travel, and even where to live. And we had recommendations to deal with the negative productivity implications of the lock-ins associated with property stamp duty. You know, this is a terrible tax, property stamp duties. It's completely indefensible, and it can be replaced. We know how to replace it.
The ACT is currently replacing it.
Well on the way to replacing it. It would be a good reform for all of the states and all of the territories. It would deal with a lot of the volatility in their budgets, as I indicated earlier, but it would also be a productivity enhancing reform.
Going back to negative gearing, that was part of an ambitious tax program that Labor took to the last election and lost.
Sure.
Do you think the problem with Labor's tax changes were the changes themselves, or was it more the sales job on the changes?
Well, I would like to avoid commentary on political salesmanship. I'd be no good at it myself, I know that.
Do you think the changes were sound? That
look, the changes proposed were different from the changes that we recommend in the tax review. What we recommended in the tax review was that instead of 50% of capital gains being discounted, only 40% of capital gains would be discounted. Instead of 100% of interest being deductible, that would also be discounted by 40%, so only 60% of interest could be deductible. On the other side, though, we recommended that only 60% of interest receipts should be assessable income. You know, even when you've got money sitting in your bank account, the interest payments on it, I know it's a small amount these days, but nevertheless, instead of all of it being included in your taxable income, only 60% of it would be. And we also recommended that 40% of rental payments, rental receipts for landlords be disregarded for tax purposes as well. And this was designed to deal with the rather perverse incentives we have in the tax system for people to invest in rental property for capital gain rather than for rental yield. Now, as to the particular proposals that Labor took to the last election, I think they were well motivated. I would have designed it slightly differently myself.
Was it better than the current system?
Let me answer the question this way, and I'm not trying to avoid it. I think it's, we're going to have to get away from the present system. And yeah, that would be better than the present system.
Given the election result, what hope do you have that a future government will be able to sell any kind of tax reform that results in some people losing out, which is most meaningful tax reforms?
Yeah, no, it's an extremely good question. I think the thing is this. People are going to lose out big time if we don't have tax reform. Really big time. Everybody's going to lose. And those who might be seen, or well, who would be losers from a particular tax reform package, if they don't get tax reform, they're going to find governments incapable of financing their needs.
So the federal government and state governments simply won't have enough money
Correct.
to keep providing
These tax
services.
systems at both the Commonwealth and the state level are simply unsustainable. We know that. We first pointed that out, when I say we, I mean the Treasury, and I was involved, of course, at the time, in the 2002 intergenerational report. We said these tax systems will not do the job. That's what we said. Now, of course, one response to that could have been, it was a sensible enough response at the time. Well, no, okay, so certain elements of government spending will increase, but we're going to cut government spending to ensure that overall the size of government does not expand. Guess what? The size of government has expanded. Not every year, but the size of government, Commonwealth government, is certainly larger today than it was back then. And in fact, it's larger today than it was in 2007, 2008. And over the forward estimates periods continues to increase. We find ourselves in a situation where, for presumably very good political reasons, and I can certainly see the social policy argument for it, there is a need to increase government spending. And we will have to increase government spending over time on worthwhile things, things that the electorate desperately needs, particularly with an ageing population. And yet we do not have a revenue system at the Commonwealth level, nor in the states and territories, that's capable of dealing with our present spending requirements, let alone the spending requirements of the future. This is unsustainable, and unless something is done, everybody's going to lose.
Going on from that issue, do you think the current government is heeding the advice it's getting from Treasury,
I have
the
no
Reserve
idea.
Bank?
Look, I have no idea, and I haven't involved myself in those. I haven't made inquiries of that sort. I really have no idea.
Given that the head of the public service has previously worked for the current Prime Minister, do you think that the public service is becoming too close to the government and losing some of its independence?
Oh, well, so there are the pluses and minuses with having somebody in a senior public service role who has worked in a ministerial office. So the negative is kind of obvious, the risk of a lack of a political perspective, or being too close to the person hearing the advice and incapable of providing robust and honest advice. That is the risk, that's the minus, and everybody sees that. The plus is also, if you think about it, also pretty obvious, which is that you have somebody, a senior public servant, who understands how the political system works, understands how Parliament House works, understands how ministers think. I was a senior policy advisor in Paul Keating's office for 5 years, back in the late 1980s. I know it's a long time ago, but I have absolutely no doubt that that experience contributed a lot to my ability to be able to offer high quality policy advice to governments of both political persuasions.
The government has announced a restructure of the public service. I know that you're no longer involved in those circles, but one of the things that stands out is the merging of the Department of Environment with the Department of Agriculture. They seem to be two quite different things.
No, they're not.
No?
No, they're not. I don't think they are. I think we should think of them as the same thing. I wasn't aware of that until you mentioned it, by the way. I haven't had an opportunity to review that particular announcement.
So that wouldn't concern you?
No, that would not
something
concern
like
me.
that
That would not
change?
concern me. Look, all these things depend upon the senior people in the department and upon the ministers. But I think one of the big challenges confronting Australia is how we use our agricultural land in a way which is more environmentally sustainable. And I know from first-hand experience that most farmers in Australia are desperately keen to see their farm land used in a more environmentally sustainable way. And if the present drought hasn't brought that home to all of Australia's farmers, well, any of Australia's farmers, they soon won't be on their land anyway. So I think that's a smart move.
If we could go to banking now, you fell on your sword after some pretty heavy personal criticism from the Banking Royal Commission. With more time to reflect now, having left NAB, what do you think went wrong during your time as chairman?
I think not dealing quickly enough with emerging problems, being prepared to interpret emerging problems as being of an administrative or technical rather than of that sort of nature, rather than something which goes to the way that the bank impacts on its customers.
And perhaps the incentives that were driving those issues?
Yeah, maybe. And I still have an open mind on that question. I know it's easy to conclude that that's the fundamental problem, that the way in which people are remunerated drives all instances of bad behaviour. I know that not to be true. It's not true in every case. It's certainly true in some cases that became evident in the Royal Commission, in some cases that we were aware of ourselves long before the Royal Commission
like the
was in call.
Introducer program.
Correct. And I don't want to diminish the significance of that or downplay the significance of that at all. But in terms of the overall operations of a bank, when a board becomes aware of that, do they automatically conclude that there's a systemic problem here, or do they rather conclude that that is something which needs to be fixed and it needs to be fixed quickly, but it doesn't really give us much information about the broader system? And and what I'm saying to you is, I think we were too often concluding that it didn't really give us information about the rest of the system. And we should have been less, we should have come to that conclusion much more reluctantly, we should have pressed harder.
Did you need to do more inquiries of your management?
No, there's no doubt. Absolutely.
Do you think shareholders need to get used to lower returns from their banks now that banks are under pressure to treat their customers more fairly rather than just profit line items?
Yes, I do. Well, let me put it this way. I could answer the question this way. I think they are getting used to lower dividends.
So do you think that a lot of the profit growth that Australian banks enjoyed over the past 15 or 20 years really was driven by milking more money out of their customers than perhaps was fair?
No, I think that's probably... Look, it must have something to do with it, but I think it's actually at the margin. I mean, I know they're big numbers when you look at the customer remediation payments that are being paid by all of the banks, and you're looking at billions of dollars as like a lump sum. Even so, the banking system is huge, and that is actually quite a small proportion of a very small proportion of the total revenue of the Australian banking system.
But that doesn't include the higher interest rates that many customers, especially if
No, well,
the
that
major
is true.
banks pay.
No,
because of the lack
that is
of
true.
competition.
That is true, and the banking system does need to ask itself, and is asking itself, serious questions about different customers receiving different prices for essentially standard products.
Back in February, you told the ABC that the Royal Commission shined a spotlight on who should take accountability
Yes.
at the banks.
Yes.
Now, Westpac's chief executive and chairman dug in for several days after the AUSTRAC revelations around money laundering before they quit. Do you think some bankers, some senior bankers, are still struggling to learn those lessons from the Royal Commission?
I don't want to comment on any other bank. I won't comment on any other bank. I don't understand and couldn't possibly know all of the circumstances that they were confronting at the time. For me and for Andrew Thorburn, the decision was difficult. It was a difficult decision, but it was also a reasonably obvious decision to make, that somebody, the most senior people actually, had to take accountability for what had gone on in the bank over such a long period of time. Of course, we could have identified, and we did identify, other senior people in the bank who were more closely accountable and more obviously accountable for particular things. But when you put it all together, how could the two most senior people in the organisation have stood there and said, we have dealt with our accountability by dealing with others? And we couldn't.
More generally, and I'm not specifically referring to Westpac here, although clearly it has some relevance, but how could bank leaderships be so relaxed about their institutions potentially being exploited by criminals, and in some cases, terrorists or pedophiles?
No, I don't want to answer that question, because the premise of the question is that people were relaxed, and I know that's the interpretation, the public interpretation. I don't know.
It's AUSTRAC's interpretation in the Westpac case.
Okay, but I don't want to comment on another bank. Honestly, it's hard enough reflecting on NAB circumstances.
Finally, taking a look at the big picture, what's your view on Australia's long-term economic, or short and long-term economic outlook?
Short term is obviously, we're in a weak patch, and as I indicated earlier, the question is whether this is cyclical or secular. I fear that it's more than cyclical, that we need to find a way of getting ourselves out of this hole. The longer term prospects are extraordinarily bright. When you consider Australia's position in the Asian century, and as you know, I led the development of a white paper on Australia in the Asian century for the Gillard government, other countries would not be able to restrain themselves from grabbing the opportunities that Australia has. And it's not limited, Australia's opportunities are not limited to coal and iron ore, and even education, from which we've benefited enormously as a country, but for all sorts of businesses and all sorts of services, and agri-product as well, high quality agri-product as well. Our future is incredibly bright. And
there's an if there. I can hear an if.
Yeah, there is an if. There is an if. And it's this. So if our future is so bright, why is business confidence so weak and been so weak for so long? Why is consumer confidence so weak and being so weak for so long? I think there is a need to construct an optimistic narrative for all Australians about Australia's long-term future, and then to back that narrative up with serious policy action.
And what is that policy action?
Well, it goes back to the things I mentioned before. It's policy action to lift productivity, and productivity will be lifted by things that we can do to enhance what economists call total factor or multi-factor productivity. But importantly, and even more importantly, by initiatives that we can undertake in order to lift business investment. Do you know, business investment today as a proportion of gross domestic product is almost as low as it was in the depths of the early 90s recession. And in fact, in no time since has it been so low. The reason why Australia celebrates a current account surplus today is because business investment is so weak.
We should not be capital.
Yeah, we should not be celebrating this. This is sending us a signal that there's something desperately wrong in Australia, and that we need policies that support a higher level of business confidence, that gives business the confidence and the incentives to invest, lift Australia's investment rate, lift Australia's capital stock, more capital per worker, higher productivity, higher wages off the back of that.
But given that company tax cuts would effectively reduce the incentive because there is a tax write-off for investing, how would that do anything to boost investment?
No. A lower company tax rate would give a greater incentive for investment. Sure, the write-off is lower, but less of the profit is taxed.
So in the long term?
In the long term. Sure.
Ken Henry, thank you very much for joining us on The Business.
Pleasure to be with you.